I pulled all the stuff off my wall again. It's actually way more turquoise in reality. This camera misrepresents how blue this wall is. Welcome back to Ravnica, and the series that asks, but what about this seemingly unimportant background detail? Tell me more about that. Please? And I can call it a series now without it being a lie, because this is part 2. I'm a Silvermere, but my name is James still. Hello. It's time again to look at the poorest citizens of Magic's premier city plane and ponder on who they are and what that means by taking a look at how they're represented. And because this is part 2, we'll look at Ravnica's sequel. A great big brand new block of cards, just like the original, but 6 years later on. In Return to Ravnica, Wizards of the Coast do just that, and we've got a whole load of cards, a few books, and a giant stack of short stories to go with Ravnica's sequel block. Last time, which if you haven't, watch part 1, this won't make any sense. Last time, we found out that the guildless people of Ravnica have a pretty rough time on the plane, under the boot of the oppressive guilds, and in the original block, they were even magically relegated to second-class citizen status by the plane's power structure. I'm going to take a slightly different approach this time, now that we all know who the guilds are. And there's actually a larger stretch of in-universe time here than I realized, with a series of political shifts and a lot of opportunities to ask how it all affects the ungilded, as we run down this period of Ravnican history. And turmoil really is the theme of the era. Everything's up in the air, and there's everything to play for, and amidst it all, the guildless are still here, staying out of the way, and quietly making up the majority of the population. Or nearly the majority. What does this second trip to Ravnica have in store for them? You can find out by staying right there! Or by continuing to walk down the street, holding your phone directly in front of your face, like you're already doing. In what will be the only time I'm going to say this, I promise, let's return to Ravnica with Return to Ravnica. Anyway, the first intro up and had to reshoot it, and the rest of the video was shot like a month and a half ago, so take it away, slightly younger me, before Return to Ravnica. Oh, come on, what? We're not even there yet. It's in the title. It is the title. I literally just made that bad joke you were already sick of 9 years ago. Yeah, I didn't know this before I started researching this part, but the gap of time between the two Ravnica sets is way more important to this series than I realized. There's a whole chunk of Ravnican history here, shrouded in mystery, that doesn't have any associated cards. I spent so much time looking at the actual Ravnica blocks that I couldn't see the guildless for the cards. Or lack thereof, when really, I should have been looking here, between sets. And a whole lot has changed for Ravnica since we last saw her, but even more has changed for Magic. And now I'm going to have to talk about some stuff that won't seem super relevant until later. So the last original Ravnica block set, Dissension, was out in May 2006, and the first Return to Ravnica block set, Return to Ravnica, was out in October 2012. A lot of magic happened between these 2 points, and most of it isn't super relevant to this, but the most impactful of all these releases, at least in terms of the story, was Time Spiral, which came out a little after the original Ravnica. Now, I didn't need to talk about Planeswalkers in the last video, because they were absent from Ye Olde Ravnica, but they're kind of a big deal in Magic. Planeswalkers are sentient beings of various different races, but usually human, able to travel at will between the myriad planes of Magic's multiverse. I don't know how the word myriad works now. I guess I'll say both. Able to travel at will between the myriad of planes in Magic's multiverse. That sounds terrible. I think people are using it wrong. I think you're using it wrong. It's myriad landscape, so it's... Anyway. From a story perspective, this allows Wizards to keep a consistent cast of characters whilst jumping between different settings. Back in the day, and I mean really back in the real day, the 90s, Planeswalkers were godlike beings, able to create life and build worlds. They were far too powerful to actually be portrayed as cards, only showing up in art or the books or when they're pretending to be lowly mortals. And instead, the role of the Planeswalker in the game was given to the player. You're a Planeswalker, champ. You're your very own Urza, and that's why you have the power to shape the earth into mountains or summon demons and angels from far-off realms. And this is still kind of true. The player is still supposedly a Planeswalker. It's just a lot more unclear nowadays for reasons you already know or will become clear in a minute. So cut to Time Spiral in 2006 and Wizards decide to change things up. Now I'm not going to get into the story of Time Spiral because this video is already way longer than I meant it to be. But I've linked a video by MTGLoreSeeker that explains it in more detail if you're interested. Basically though, Wizards did a big DC Crisis-style lore reboot called the Mending. And the Mending marks the point in Magic's timeline where the nature of Planeswalkers fundamentally changed forever. No longer were they nigh unkillable beings of immense power. They were mortal. Downgraded all the way from the ability to make worlds to the ability to just be a particularly gifted mage in whatever field of magic they specialize in. They can still travel the multiverse, just like they did before, but they're a lot easier to kill nowadays, and they're just far less powerful than the old walkers. Changing planeswalkers this way accomplished at least two things. First, it meant that planeswalkers could finally actually be cards. The power level of these new walkers was exactly the kind of thing that could be a card now. We've got a new card type! Hooray! But the player is still a planeswalker. They're just far more powerful than the ones that are cards, even though in the lore, the nature of all the planeswalkers change and everyone has been depowered. And second, in theory, planeswalkers can be more grounded, more human, more relatable characters. So whilst often the older books would focus more on non-walkers, and old planeswalker characters like Urza would eventually become too powerful to continue being Magic's main man, and needed to be relegated to the role of needlessly cryptic background character who should really offer up more information than he does. Almost since their inception, the new walkers have pointedly remained the main characters of Magic. Also, Wizards, please make a new Pantheon image. There's loads of people missing from this, and you're better at representation nowadays. Wizards like to cycle through their current primary cast with shifting regularity, typically shoving a couple into each set to helm the marketing and be a familiar constant wherever or not the setting is. Some planeswalkers appear a lot more frequently than others, but the most main of all these main characters is the original new blue walker, Jace Beleren. One of the 5 original walker cards, printed into the set to follow Time Spiral, Jace Beleren is as old as the planeswalker card type. All of these 5 first walkers would receive extensive backstorying later on, but at the time, they just showed up in Lorwyn, with zero story justification. Apparently they were actually due to appear in Time Spiral, but there was already too much weird going on there mechanically, and so they were just unceremoniously dumped into the upcoming set. They really were just dumped there though, and few cards feel as out of place to me in all of Magic, to be honest, as the Lorwyn 5. Lorwyn was designed as this humble, Welsh folklore-inspired fairy tale world, and the rare plane in Magic's multiverse that doesn't have any humans. And now, out of nowhere, 4 human characters and a Catman were getting rammed into the set. As much as they're in the set, they're not actually in the setting though, and it seems like Jace is the only one who might have actually ever even been to Lorwyn, lore-wise. And if you bought the Lorwyn novels to find out about these cool new planeswalkers, well, you, they're literally not in this story at all. I know we've barely started and I'm way off topic, I just wanted to moan about the Lorwyn 5 for a second. It was just such a failure of flavour. A flavia, if you will. The Lorwyn 5, as they shouldn't be called, deserved better. Lorwyn deserved way better. So as the story for the Planeswalkers was effectively missing, appearing only as a quick profile for each around Lorwyn's release, Wizards set to fleshing out their new characters through a series of novels. The first of these, Agents of Artifice by Ari Marmel, came out in 2009, slap bang in the middle between Original Rav and Return to Ravnica, and it sets about giving some character to Jace, who will go on to become the biggest of their poster childs and the closest thing Magic has to a protagonist, at least for a long period. I know all this Planeswalker talk doesn't feel super relevant to Ravnica and the Guildless, but it will become increasingly more so as we go on. I gotta put it in somewhere, so it's going here. Agents' story involves Jace working for and then turning against a shady, interplanar, Demir-esque organization. Alongside a few other Planeswalkers that had cards at the time, Jace has some good fun times and some less fun times, planeshopping between a few settings we'd already seen. We'll get back to Jace more later, but the foremost of these settings returning in the novel, and Jace's chosen home, was Ravnica. And the Ravnica that we see in the book is a far cry from any Ravnica we'll see on any block of cards. Ravnica sans guilds. So if you recall, when we last saw the city plane, it was reeling, not only from a bunch of monsters crashing about and people's limbs flying off, but also from the destruction of the Guild Pact, the magical contract that kept the guilds from tearing each other apart, but also kept them in power. Teysa Karlov, the Orzhov advocist and envoy to the ruling Ghost Council, is kind of a big deal and someone I probably should have brought up last video, but she drafted the non-magical replacement for the Guild Pact that the guilds all supposedly agreed to last time. And I had always assumed that the faux pact was pretty effective, given that Return to Ravnica still had all the guilds in it. But apparently it really wasn't, and between the two Ravnica blocks, the guilds all mostly devolved and diminished in the real pact's absence. There are basically 2 sources for this period of Ravnica between blocks that apparently spans about 64 years. Agents of Artifice and an article on Wizard's site from Return's release that quickly runs us through Ravnican history up to the beginning of Return's story and summarizes how the guilds fell. They describe a city whose power structure has shattered. A city that's been carved up by the wealthy and the power-hungry, and exists as a connected network of fiefdoms, all serving their own individualized hierarchies. Many of these controlled by Orzhov families, who always own as much land as they can, but are now decentralized and lacking any of their religious facade, often no longer even serving the Obsidian. The Boros, broken apart, exist mostly as bodyguards and security for hire, often just for those with the most Orzhov coin. The Azorius almost collapsed after the death of their guild hall and leader at the end of Dissension, so they're in no state to try and enforce the law, and law and order, at this time on Ravnica, exist only where they can be paid for, and are often little more than the whims of petty tyrants. But with the Gruul expanding and the chaos of everything, preying on the weak without the pact to shackle them, many people would have to move to where it's safe, or try to keep living where it's dangerous. Agents shoves us into this lawless, guildless world from the very beginning, while we're struggling to work out who we're actually following in this book. Have you read it? That joke's for you! Don't read it! We open in one of Ravnica's poorer regions, Avaric, outside of the central city's 10 districts, and built on shaky foundations atop a swamp. The picture of Avaric we're painted is rarely pretty. The fog of Ironberry wine didn't make the filthy cobblestones, the half-decayed roofs, or the sludge coating the roadways any more attractive. And the sweet aroma of that libation didn't remain in the nose long enough to muffle the stagnant rot and the eye-watering miasma that passed for air. Jesus. It was a backwater district, surrounded by other backwater districts, save for the few spots where the underground swamps pooled to the surface, ugly and malodorous cysts on Ravnica's aging face. Those who dwelt here did so only because any place else they could afford to move was even worse, and a few small fungus gardens were more than enough to feed the lot of them. And alongside all the muck, it's also covered in danger. Only a couple of pages in, and one of our heroes, everyone in this book is kind of a villain, to be honest. The Black Mana Planeswalker Liliana is enjoying the festivities of Thraldom's End with the rest of the district when she's attacked, openly, in the place's largest pub by a group of well-armed hired goons. A pretty bloody, destructive fight ensues, and at no point is anyone expecting any local authorities to show up. And they don't. Not even the Hasda, who don't show up in the novel at all, and that makes me mildly sad. I'm guessing they're pretty overworked right now, but given how much we traipse through Guildless Ravnica in the novel, their omission feels like an oversight. A teeny lore one, but still. The central city may have fared a little better though, and in some of the short stories for Return, you get the sense that at least some of the guilds held on to their central seats of power in the 10th, even as the limbs of their organizations fractured. A little later in the novel, but earlier in its timeline, we get a view of one of the wealthier districts of Ravnica, and it's a world away from Avaric. This was Ravnica. Ravnica as she was meant to be. The district of Dravhog flowed down the shallow mountainside like an avalanche trapped in amber, bewitching beneath the brilliant sun. Great buildings of gleaming marble lined the wide byways, their roofs sharply sloped, their eaves adorned by figures both abstract and concrete, angelic and diabolical. Some were only a handful of stories tall, but many more towered impossibly, monolithically into the infinite sky. Nestled amongst all this luxury, we find Jace. Near the uppermost levels, in the midst of that broad and sloping avenue, Jace Beleren sat beneath a parasol at an open-air cafe called Heavenly Ambrosius and sipped a glass of cold mint tea. Living it larger than he can afford off the backs of various people he's apparently blackmailing with secrets he's gleamed off them with his mind magic. It's not a great look for the guy who'll go on to become Magic's main man, but I do appreciate that Ari Marmel lets Jace get a bit grimy in the interest of giving him room to grow. He just doesn't stick out from all the other grimy grimers in this novel, and there's a few. By the end of the novel, he'll have done a lot of messed up stuff, mostly to people's brains, but he'll also have gained his independence, and a realization that he doesn't have much of a stomach for hurting people, at least. But anyway, back in that fancy cafe where we first see him, and whilst he's sipping his overpriced tea, Jace is also attacked publicly. But his immediate response, nestled in the lap of luxury, is to just let the Boros' remains deal with it. Dravhog was, after all, wealthy enough to employ patrols of the Cloud-Winged Guard, an organization made up of a few surviving remnants of what had been the Legion of Wojciech. Former keepers of Ravnica's law and order, they boasted a reputation for dealing with lawbreakers swiftly, efficiently, and permanently. So yeah, justice might be even more spiky than when the Legion was in full force, but there is some modicum of safety here for Ravnica's high society, even in these guildless times. The Cloudwing Guard can't boast the numbers of their previous Boros incarnation though, and they're stretched pretty thin. Even the central city is gradually breaking without the guilds. This was Ravnica at her richest, but even here she was slowly dying. Just a tiny bit more every day since the guilds fell. There may be some remaining areas of relative normalcy, but the point is, it's the Wild West out there for much of the plane. Or the Middle Ages, one of the two. Combine the two. That's what it is. So, is this guildless period of Ravnica actually beneficial to the guildless? Many amongst the poorest we see in Avaric seem to relish the destruction of the guilds. The festival that Liliana's enjoying when the goons show up, Thraldom's End, is celebrated by Ravnica's poorer regions and commemorates the death of the guilds. And more pointedly, for the people of Avaric, their freedom from serfdom to the Orzhov Patriarchs, now that that guild has splintered. It seems at some point in the 60-year gap after Dissension, before Agents of Artifice, the anti-guild sentiment from the original block came to a head, and some of the guildless rose up and may have been instrumental in the guild's removal themselves. Selesnya, particularly, seems to have been forcibly, violently removed for their part in powering the oppressive guild pact and accidentally unleashing all those ghost monks on everyone. I guess the Simic were too destroyed at this point to be the well-deserved focus of everyone's rage. As much as many districts celebrate Thraldom's End during this era, more apparently still celebrate the festival of the guild pact and pine for the days of the guilds' structure over the tumult of their absence. Whilst those districts that struggled most under the guilds might be enjoying a bit more freedom from them in this time, for many others, that freedom comes with unpredictable violence, fickle authorities, and a greater potential for rhinos. It's no doubt good for some, but I find it hard to believe that the people of Ravnica would generally be better off under proper feudalism than with their still very oppressive, but at least structured guild-based government. At the end of the day, or at any point in it really, the guildless are generally the least powerful on Ravnica and the most affected by these violent political shifts. And while some Orzhov families at this time have ditched the name and technically fall under the umbrella of guildless, the common folk of Ravnica are potentially never more vulnerable than now. The power vacuum of the guild's wake has been filled with opportunists as chaos wails outside, and the common folk find themselves lending their blood to the conflict once again. Their conditions under the pact don't allow the guildless to accrue any real power, so once it's gone, the former guilds are still in charge, splintered but also unshackled to be as terrible as they like. So, ironically, the guildless era of Ravnica is most likely the worst era for the city's guildless population. With Ravnica turning so decisively away from the guilds at this time, it makes me wonder if this was closer to the original vision of Ravnica 2. Perhaps at some point we were due to visit this scoured, feudal Ravnica with a lovely set of cards, but I can't find any evidence of this, and everywhere that the making of Return to Ravnica is discussed, it seems that the focus was always the guilds, just like with Ravnica 1. Who cares if the writing has pushed our setting in a specific direction? That's what steering wheels are for! It's about face time! Return to the Guilds of Ravnica. We made it! It's the thing that I said the video was about, see? I have never lied, and I'm offended by the implication. It's time to finally return to Ravnica as we know her in Return to Ravnica. I said I wouldn't do that. Wizards' intent with Return, smartly, was to focus on what made the first block such a success. The bloody guilds! In contrast to a then recently prior block, Innistrad, where Wizards had sought to give some new mechanical identity to the colour combinations in the block, Return would see them retread the ground they walked for Ravnica 1, and lean into the mechanical identities they had established for the colour combinations with the original guilds. Return to Ravnica would look to capture and recreate the successes of the first block, whilst improving on its elements where they could. It would be a true sequel to the first block, in like a video game sense. Just like the first block, it was a pretty big deal, and whilst it didn't quite have the same impact as the original did on the game, it was generally well received and remembered by players. Many were excited to come back to Ravnica, and the marketing was out in force to make sure that anyone who didn't already know the plane would be enticed by its colourful guilds and civic aesthetic. To achieve this, all the guilds would receive a bit of a touch-up, both mechanically and aesthetically, and we'll get more into their changes a bit later on, but first, they would all need to actually return to the setting themselves. Despite what their dwindling state between blocks would imply, the guilds would all make a swift return to Ravnica just in time for Return to Ravnica. As Adam Lee from the block's creative team put it took time, but the populace's distrust for the guilds faded, and slowly they returned. Old guild loyalties that never truly died out began to coalesce, and new guild masters emerged to take the lead, attempting to bring their guilds back to full strength. in a domino effect, the guilds re-emerge, egged on by each other and their own ambition not to be left behind. The Orzhov construct grand cathedrals and return to their religious facade to re-establish their grip over the guild and the populace. The Azorius build a new set of ivory towers to peer indifferently down from, and the Boros have a new, more passionate angel leader who is thirsty to bring justice to the guild and the city. The two surviving Parons, that means guild founder, by the way. It's a word I probably should have said sometime last video. Paron, guild founder. The two surviving Parons that are mobile, Niv Mizzet and Rakdos, both return from separate absences, unknown and in lava, respectively, and the Izzet and the cult each fall in line under their leaders immediately. Under the city, the Golgari have pretty much been carrying on as they always were anyway, and the Dimir don't want to be left out, and so they decide they might even open a public office or two this time. Gruul clans have only grown in numbers and clans since the Pact fell anyway, and just like that, the guilds are back. Ravnica's ready to be a set of cards again. The population's distrust has faded with memory, and at least enough of them welcome the return of the guilds and order to Ravnica. But there was one guild that was really in no state to return. The Simic were in the most sorry state of any guild when we last saw them at the end of the old block, having had the direction of their entire guild's efforts used secretly against them by their own leader to try and wipe out the plane with his big ooze, Experiment Kraj. Remember in the last block how the Simic leader Moma Vig dished out free, gooey organ and limb replacement globules to everyone, and then stole them back to make a big goo monster and kill everybody. The Simic dished out cytoplasts, as they called the healing globs, to anybody that needed them, the majority of the guild having no idea of their ultimate function. Most of the Simic Combine had cytoplastic enhancements themselves, and were all injured or killed along with all the patients when the cytoplasts all merged into Kraj, leaving only, I imagine, a handful of the actually dedicated Simic clinics, now struggling with much less or recently mangled staff, a huge influx of patients, and no access to their primary method of healthcare because it was a secret evil plan all along. The Simic were effectively gone, and it was going to take a bit more writing finagling than the other guilds to bring them back in line for the set. There are oceans beneath the earth. Okay, so the new Simic are, like I said last time, really into biomancy still, but they're comprised primarily, nowadays, of a group of previously unseen merfolk. Ravnica has merfolk now, which is pretty neat considering Ravnica is such a diverse plane, and merfolk were perhaps the most iconic magic tribe that had no representation there at all. They're the characteristic blue tribe, according to wizards, and the only one of the 5 characteristic color tribes not already on Ravnica, so they were inserted into Rav through the new Simic. Where on earth did merfolk come from on Ravnica, planet of cities, though? Well, under the earth. You see, all across Ravnica, the new Simic have been emerging from lakes and rivers, etc. Within these bodies of water, large, intricate, tunnel-esque, tower-esque structures have surfaced, leaking fishfolk guild members eager to meet the city dwellers. Described as upturned skyscrapers, the Simic Zonots, as they're called, open on Ravnica's surface on one end, but the other end descends down into unknown depths, deeper than we've seen before. When giant sinkholes opened across Ravnica, they revealed buried oceans and the merfolk, once thought to be extinct. If you've ever wondered where are Ravnica's oceans, well, it turns out they were right here all along. This isn't a retcon, and Ravnica has always had a delightfully mysterious amount of connected underground seas right there under the sewers, under the pavement. It seems like at least some of these are of the naturally forming variety of underground sea that I will never be able to afford. But apparently some of Ravnica's ocean at least was indeed built over and then seemingly forgotten about until the Simic 2.0 emerged and reminded everybody that yes, there is still an ocean right here. Maybe like me, you find it a little hard to believe that people could just pavement over the ocean and then just forget that it's there, but Agents of Artifice does give us a description of a Ravnican lake district that could give us some clue as to how people could forget about building over the sea. Favariel was built above the surface of a deep body of fresh water, the size of a small sea. The avenues and plazas stood supported by pylons that dug deep into the lake's murky floor, the buildings on great spans supported by those avenues and plazas. Unless one stood at the side of the roadway and deliberately looked over the edge, one might never notice the lake at all. So, kinda like that, but even more Ravnica. 10 numbered Simic Zonots have emerged across the plane as entrances to the depths, one of which, 7, emerged in the 10th district and acts as the new Simic Guild Hall. Although, unsettlingly, Zonnet 7's emergence particularly implies that at least some, but maybe even huge amounts of Ravnica's central city are sat atop a hidden body of water. I need that flavor text. What's it called? Tentacle mill. I know it mills, it does something with milling. Hey, drowned secrets. Okay. Beneath Ravnica's streets runs a layer of tunnels, then caverns and waterways, then terrors and nightmares. Residing alongside these terrors are the true, secret, actual, double-secret mole people of Ravnica. The fish people. Sorry, the Golgari, they've been here since forever, don't you know? This isn't a retcon. Aware of the surface dwellers, but absent from their world until the other 9 guilds' strangely united resurgence drew them back to the surface to take the place of Moma Vig's imploded organization. Mechanically and to behold, they're quite similar to the original Simic. They like creature types, +1/+1 counters, and putting tentacles on things still. But whilst they still spend as much time in the lab grafting arms, their mission statement is a lot less murderous. Prime Speaker Zagana, their guild leader for this block, makes a public address to the people of Ravnica to cement their place as the new Simic guild. Their goal is to protect the natural spaces of Ravnica, primary of those being its hidden oceans, and they believe the best way to do this is by cooperating with its surface. They have an internal struggle over their 2 primary values. Basically, conservation, they call holdfast, and progress, they call upwelling. And as they are still the Simic, it does seem to favour the latter. I'm sure they do more for conservation than the previous Simic, but that doesn't stop them from churning out fish, octopus, crabs. Ultimately though, the new Simic looks to provide a service to the plane, and wants to build a bridge between the Ravnica of the surface and the Ravnica below. Our home is fathoms down, and we will remain tethered to it forever. We strive for an enduring connection between Ravnica's highest heights and deepest depths. And we seek your help. We are the Simic. Love the new sea salt flavoured Simic, love the underground merfolk angle, love their new look, but the thing that confuses me, why are they the Simic? I mean, I know why, it's because we're returning to Ravnica, and Ravnica has Simic, but why would this completely detached group of merfolk who had nothing to do with the probably definitely mass murder that Moma Vig caused want to use the name of his organisation? I get that the new Simic basically showed up and said, nice blue-green power vacuum you have there, shame if someone filled it, and maybe there's some surviving Simic infrastructure they want to utilise, but why do they want to be called the Simic? During her address, Zagana brings up Vig's atrocities and basically says, it'll be nothing like that, I promise. But the only reason you have to say that, and people are associating you with them anyway, Zagana, is because you arbitrarily chose to use the name of an organisation that tricked and killed a bunch of innocent people when you could have called yourself literally anything else. I'm just going to assume they have to be called that for guild pact reasons and move on. Guilds have returned to Ravnica. You wouldn't necessarily know it from looking at the cards, but after the Guildless era, the guild's position on Ravnica is a lot less concrete this time about the pact to enforce it. They may have all returned to meet the set, but that doesn't mean the guild pact has, and the only thing keeping the guilds from each other's lands and throats is the ineffective baby paper pact. The guilds are in a fragile state, and they're all deeply paranoid of each other while they rebuild guild halls and guild members. They're even in PR mode, at least a little, and in the novels they've all got recruitment on the mind, and they've even got these goofy little kiosks handing out flyers like it's a job fair. It's adorable. Look, the kiosks are even in the art for Maze's End. I never noticed them before. The guilds need the general population to give them their numbers and their power over the general population. But we know how the guilds treat the population when they're in power. Do the guilds need the guildless only so they can continue to act like they always have? Like I said, the guilds in Return to Ravnica were designed to play off the strengths of the original guilds, and the Simic, the closest that any of them have had to a reinvention. If the guilds are back to their old tricks, does that mean what we already know it means for the guildless? Let's find out! The Azorius are under the leadership of a massive sphinx now, and they're just as detached and bureaucratic and controlling as ever. We also get a glimpse at a fair amount of corruption in the governmental guild. The block's short stories particularly show them taking bribes to let the Orshov detain people at their leisure, fining people for being next to a riot, and denying compensation to the bereaved victims of a collapsed tenement building for spelling the word believe wrong on their application. But what of the justice system? Surely that will be more fair. We will prove your guilt. We don't arrest the innocent, you know. An elocutor forces criminals to confess to the laws they merely intended to break. Thanks, guys. That sounds great. After getting back to their cathedrals, the Orzhov are basically the same as last time, and still win the knob end crown for being the biggest predators. Now, in their endless pursuit of creatively obliterating the impoverished, they're even employing the alien from Alien. It's sent into ungilded districts by the Orzhov to collect the souls of those no one will miss. I guess they got it on loan from Sheoldred. But at least now they're riding around throwing out coins. That seems nice. Alms coins are only redeemable at Orzhov businesses. Nothing untoward there. I'm sure it's worth heading down to Orzhova to redeem them. Neither the Azorius nor the Orzhov have had hugely updated designs, but I like how each uses protruding and cumbersome elements to create a literal space between their guild members and the city, highlighting their detachment from it. The Dimir are sneaking about, obviously, and I still think they look too spiky most of the time, but sometimes they look really awesome. They're even letting people know they exist this time, kind of. But they're again focused on fulfilling another confusing plan by a new guild leader, the mysterious shapeshifter Lazav, unseen causer of traffic jams. One tiny peg pulled from a single wagon wheel, and an entire district grinds to a halt. I suppose he doesn't actually sound like that, does he? He has like an established voice.
So myopic in their quest for power that they're unaware of our machinations.
In the short story, The Hard Sell, that Bane Alley broker who looks so cool does get a hapless, guildless guy robbed for the dagger she duped him into buying. But she's nice enough to specify that her assailants don't murder him, at least, like they usually would. It's nice to have a bit of proof of the Dimir's machinations actually harming the ungilded here, even if it's more individualized and not as systemic of a problem as with the other guilds. Still, I've got your bloody number, the Dimir. When Niv Mizzet showed up again not long before return, the Izzet League reconvened from their shattered state to focus, as much as an Izzet can, their work collectively under the dragon. But of course, they're back to their Izzety ways. They like electricity even more now, if that's possible. And just like before, they have a huge list of things that have needed fixing since their absence, and maybe they'll get round to at some point. With the Izzet occupied elsewhere, many of their public works fell into disrepair. After their leader finally wakes from his lava sleep, the Cult of Rakdos lean a little bit more into their carnival aesthetic, but still love causing as much havoc as possible. The short story, Life in the Ring, follows a performer and a young wannabe at one of the Rakdos clubs, and it just gives some much needed texture to the world of the Rakdos and makes them feel more like an actual part of the city than they ever did in the original block. We see the performer taking Izzet potions and Simic tonics to withstand their act, and expressing that they do what they do out of a desire to maximize their probably short life that they view as a gift from the demon whose power they fear. The Rakdos feel a lot more integrated now, and across the block's short stories, we have tales of Rakdos establishments luring in Azorius and Orzhov officials with their dark delights to become returning customers. Each day, uncertainty and rumors spread, and each night, attendance at the jury review increases. Card-wise, they're mostly mayhem motivated, and I also want to point out this guy who's forcibly recruiting for them. Its victims become mindless lunatics. Conveniently, that's the first step in joining the Cult of Rakdos. And there's a line from one of the shorts where they're making bets with people. Ringleaders always made wagers with each other over the games. Sometimes for money, sometimes for people, sometimes for promises. So they're still doing some slavery, still harming the Guildless, just more believably now. The Golgari have kept to themselves since the first block, and kept on keeping on, underground. They're rot farming and feeding the commoners still, and they're less plainly scary than last time. They're a bit more varied in their presentation, and their perspective is even getting a bit more empathy from wizards this time around. Enter those who are starving and sick. You are welcome among the swarm when the rest of Ravnica rejects you. I love this Ellis Island vibe for their Guildgate. It just gives them some much needed depth card-wise, and Societal Outcast is a great cloak for a Golgari. Again though, they are still at least a bit scary, and in the pursuit of all that free food, you might still meet a grisly end beneath the streets. The Gruul were being baddies during the Guildless era, preying on the weak while they expanded, so that's definitely going on the rap sheet. They're probably in a better state than most of the guilds at the minute, having grown while the others diminished. Many Ravnicans think of nature as orderly groves and elf-tended rot farms. They haven't seen the Gruul wilds. Smashing stuff with either clubs or wild animals is still their forte, but like the Rakdos, there's a bit more nuance in their presentation this time around. Look, they're even managing to walk the streets without smashing the streets. Wowee. The Boros Legion I'm in two minds about. Their new angel leader, Aurelia, is characterized as a lot more involved than the guild's founding angel. In the short stories, The Greater Good and The Battle for the Ninth, she employs the help of the heroic, He-Man-esque, white mana planeswalker Gideon Jura, who's hanging out on Ravnica at this time, although him and Jace don't know each other yet. Aurelia wants Gideon's help to restore order to the central city's 9th district, which, during the guild's remission, has become a constant war zone between the Gruul and the Rakdos, with the Dimir pulling the strings. And Aurelia does seem to genuinely care about the innocent ungilded affected by the conflict, even to the point of restraining her own response to the uppity guilds. The innocent always pay the highest price. I would love to go in there with some Cinder Elementals and burn out every last Rakdos, Gruul, and Dimir, but ungilded Ravnicans have been living there for centuries in relative peace. That's a pretty great level of restraint and care for the new leader of the Boros, but it's not 100% consistent with her presentation on the cards. When justice descends, the servant will burn with the master. Scores will die in the name of peace. That is what you call compromise? Gideon Jura to Aurelia. Nothing like this happens in their interactions in the short stories, and I'm pretty sure they've not interacted anywhere else at this point, so I'm just confused by this line of flavor text. If we take it all as canon, I suppose Aurelia's motives might be just, but her actions will, regardless, accrue a body count befitting a Boros leader. I think the flavor text for Boros charm sums her up pretty well. Practice compassion and mercy, but know when they must end. This is just a great line of text for a spell that can benevolently save all of your things, or whack or burn your opponent's face. Aurelia is definitely better for the Boros than their aloof founder from the original set, or the angel who led the guild between blocks and let them fracture and turn mercenary. The Boros under Aurelia might be better for the city and the Guildless than any Boros before us, but one good cop can't change the system overnight, even if she is at the top. The Boros are still the Boros. They still see responding to Ravnica's problems as a big game of whack-a-mole, and they still use violence for things you just don't need to use it for, like archery practice. Archers from the Horizon Military Academy hone their skills by targeting pickpockets blocks away. And PR. We lost respect after the Battle of Barbu Rooftop. Send the troops to mingle respectfully with the citizens. Honestly, from their armor, these guys actually look ungilded to me, but the quote is from a Boros commander, so I don't know. I love this Goblin Third who doesn't want to get involved. I can't tell if he's laughing or if he's like, what has become of us? Oh my god, how am I still on the Boros? This was supposed to be a quick rundown. New Boros Angel Leader. Pretty good. New Boros Legion. Better than previous lawless mercenary state, but still institution of hastily applied violence, generally comparable to their original showing. Next. Selesnya were having a really tough time during the Guildless years, and they were nearly extinct by RTR. They're back in force now, though, literally. 3 Dryads successfully reconnected with the guild's then-dormant Earth god, Mat Selesnya, and reinvigorated the guild's empathic link, the World Soul, themselves merging together to become the guild's new leader, Trostani. Mat's a bit more bloodthirsty than we might have imagined them, though, and before anything else, the Earth God tells Trostani to gather an army, and so that's what Selesnya are doing. They're still into their core communal values, but they're a lot more ready to militantly protect them this time around. You see a bird, an oak, a pack beast. I see the potential for an army. Even with a few more spears kicking about this time, Selesnya still generally gets a pass, though, even if Trostani comes off like an absolutely gullible moron in the novels. I don't have anywhere else to put this, so it's going here. Last time, when I brought up Birakazir, the best character ever, the wolf who briefly led the Conclave, I got his bloody parentage wrong! This isn't a picture of his son, like I said, it's a picture of his dad! Ugh. I'm so sorry, Birakazir. I'm so sorry I misrepresented you. The seafood Simic aren't into genocide, despite wanting to take the name of a genocidist. So that's good. Like I said in the last video though, they're still making tentacle monsters instead of being doctors, just now with more of a sea theme. The short story, Experiment 1, shows us a small research facility where 2 idealistic Simic researchers bemoan the direction of their guild. The power we wield over life is staggering, she said, and we have a responsibility to create more with it than biological curios. We can make things, like your lighting system here, that can improve people's lives. We can give them medical treatments unlike any others. We can make life in the city better for everyone. Ah, he said, dangerous ideas. Much simpler to toss a few animals together and see what comes out. Much safer. That gets you appointed, gets you publicity, gets you research grants. Ultimately though, even idealism like that, when channeled through simic magic, can still result in you turning yourself into a gloopy glob thing that wants to improve everyone's lives by turning them all into gloopy glob things. "You wanted to make life better," he said. "I never questioned your dedication. Come, my dear, into the vat. Remake yourself, and we will remake this broken world." So yeah, Fish Simic are definitely more concerned with preserving and improving natural life than they are with improving Ravnica's healthcare. Does anyone even remember that that's what the Simic are supposed to be doing? Being the Plains Doctors? It really is weird. Like, they never even bring it up. Zagana doesn't say, "Oh, we're gonna do this about healthcare," or even, "Oh, sorry, we're not gonna do healthcare." They just don't mention it, in favor of talking about protecting the natural spaces. And Ravnica's been without institutionalized healthcare for more than 60 years at this point. Selesnya weren't doing it, they were almost gone themselves. Does Ravnica even have healthcare by return? Do the Simic still be doctors sometimes? I have no idea. Nobody mentions it, and they're always just shown doing some sea-based lab shit. The old Simic were absolutely the more predatory of the two, but they did at least pretend to do their jobs. Even if that ended horribly for everyone. Huzzah! The status quo has returned. The guilds might have gotten some new shoulder pads and hats, but they're still doing what they usually do. Subjugating the ungilded. And now there isn't even a real guild pact to stop the guilds from tearing each other apart, and their conflicts that collaterally murder the guildless can be fierier and bloodier than ever. Whilst the guild structure doesn't offer the ungilded a lot of protection, it does at least offer them some stability when compared to the chaos of the Fractured Era. The guildless don't have much luck wherever they turn or whoever's in charge, but in return to Ravnica, at least compared to the first block, they wouldn't be so easily forgotten. With all of the guilds getting made over to various degrees, this time around, the guildless would receive that same attention. A face for the guildless. Okay, so the style guide is like the aesthetic, world-building Bible of any Magic the Gathering set. It's full of detailed sketches with notes and examples of designs from the world being depicted. The style guide is worked on by a team of concept artists and then provided to every artist working on the set to keep the art they produce in line with the style of the set. So two different artists will both know what Azorius armor looks like, or Orzhov architecture. For Return to Ravnica, each of the 10 guilds would receive updated style guide pages. But unlike the first Ravnica block, so too would the guildless. Jeremy Jarvis, the block's art director, wrote on Wizard's site about developing the style guide and how he felt that the guildless were a crucial inclusion. He talks about his aim when developing guildless attire. My self-imposed goal was to end up with enough of a fashion vocabulary that if Magic had a plane-jumping, Monster of the Week sort of television show and you tuned in late and you saw only 3 ungilded people talking around a table, you would immediately know that this episode was set on Ravnica. Oh my god, please give me that TV show. I really like this mental framework for creating memorable background designs that not only need to contrast to all these elaborately designed guilds, but also to other background characters on other worlds in the larger Magic setting. Great framework, I like it, and I really want that TV show. Jarvis took the fact that Liliana and Jace had both wandered around as guildless on Ravnica as inspiration for the ungilded designs. We know that both Jace and Liliana have spent time on Ravnica, so I played with the idea that Ravnican fashion be informed by their original costumes. Maybe they were already wearing superhero versions of Ravnican clothing. The guildless would be dressed down from the Planeswalkers, and you can definitely see elements of the two Walkers' designs in the style guide pages that were drawn up. Jace's wide gauntlet sleeve things and Liliana's arm socks. Lily's big old boots and singular bit of hip armor are here, and her off-shoulder sleeve thingies are also evoked. How do you describe clothes? Ravnicans apparently share Jace's love of straps and wearing loincloths over trousers, and his iconic cloak is evoked through these big collars and these cloaks. It's interesting that one of the elements from the guide's art that shows up the most amongst the block's designs, these big lapels, aren't found on either Jace or Lily. Jace clearly keeps up with Ravnican fashion though, and sports his own set of lapels on his fancy new jacket, which he shows off to the people of Innistrad a few years later. Using Lily and Jace as the starting point for the guildless attire makes a lot of sense given their guildless lifestyles in Agents of Artifice, but also adds to their characters by giving context to their already established outfits. Working back from the Planeswalkers, as well as apparently taking some inspiration from fashion blogs at the time, the concept team managed to create a diverse but consistent catalogue of guildless apparel that the block's artists dove right into and ran with across all the block's art that features the ungilded. The non-superhero, de-eccentricized Planeswalker garb handed to the guildless gives them this great muted look to contrast with the guilds. The ungilded have a rough and ready practical aesthetic that evokes their relative poverty and their position under the more extravagantly designed guild members. In terms of creating a common Ravnican aesthetic, I think Jarvis and his team were really successful. And if we cut in on that table with 3 ungilded in that imaginary TV show that I can't stop thinking about, I'd say you could probably grasp that we were on Ravnica. You might confuse the Guildless' love of leather and their muted tone for Innistrad, but that plane's prevalence for tricorner hats would probably set it apart. It's tricorn hat, not tricorner. I just learnt this during editing. Don't correct me, I've corrected myself. And there's enough of a fashion vocabulary, as Jarvis put it, amongst the Style Guide's designs that the Guildless can feel individualized without feeling inconsistent, which was a real problem with the original block. I mentioned this in the last video, but the original Guildless were a mess of contrasting aesthetics. And I kind of unwittingly made it seem like it was Jeff Mikola's fault, when really, I really like his work. Especially the recent showcase art he did for Kaldheim. I even like the 2 pieces I highlighted in the first video. They just look like they're from 2 different worlds. But that's not Jeff's fault, it's the Style Guides. Original Ravnica's Style Guide had pages for each of the 10 guilds, but no section on the Guildless. And so, whenever artists were prompted to draw them for the first block, they pretty much had to make it up as they went along. Which is bad world building and particularly bad at emphasizing and contrasting to the guilds, which is what the Guildless are supposed to be doing. There's definitely an argument to be made about overly detailed Style Guide pages and artist prompts leading to magic art that doesn't allow enough room for self-expression. But here, I think the results are plain to see. The Guildless have a recognizable face now and feel like a much more tangible part of the world in Return to Ravnica, rather than being something you noticed because you were looking for it and even then still fell out of place. And now that Wizards had finally deigned to grace their forgotten 11th child with a face of their own, the Guildless were also to receive more spotlight this time around. What about them Guildless then? There's some real Guildless characters amongst their cards in RTR. Not to piss on Ratcatcher or Lionheart Maverick, even if he does look like he's from Eldraine, but the Guildless in return really nailed that window into city life feeling that the first blocks aspired to. Lady Wren is the one merchant in Keyhole Downs who isn't running a scam. Rakdos cultists are her best customers. They never flinch at pain and are seldom good at math. Cartographers on Ravnica chart not just the horizontal, but also the vertical. Many Tin Street shops display a sign on the door, no cloaks allowed. Ravnica feels even more like a real place in RTR than in the original, which is a testament to the incredible work of all the artists working on the set, but also to the Guildless providing so much texture instead of being a regularly jarring element. Their understated aesthetic allows them to double up, both as effective background characters and as mini points of view for the audience, through their relatable mundanity. These delightfully ordinary feelings are exemplified through the Denizen cycle, a run of 5 monocoloured common creatures, each with the name of the street in Ravnica where they reside, and each with their own sense of average city life. There's even some real Guildless characters this time around, like with stories and everything. Across the short stories, we have far more Guildless characters than we ever saw in the first block, and even several Guildless protagonists, giving their much-needed perspective. Hawkers yelled about hats and potions and a dozen other things. The scents of fish and fruit and cheese mixed freely and strangely, and a Boris recruiter offered good coin to strong young men. "Just like this strapping fellow," he said as Bartek passed by, who were willing to join the Wojeks. Bartek hurried on. He knew what happened to strong young men who stopped by those recruitment stands if they happened to have warrants outstanding. He wondered if that was all the recruitment stands were for. Most of these named Guildless characters are relegated to the shorts, but there are a couple that get cards themselves. Fibblethip had always hated crowds, and he was going to show up here, because I always thought he was Guildless, and then I actually read his story and it turns out he's Azorius, so well done me. I even hit him in the crowd, in the thumbnail for the first video, and we all know that's the last place he'd want to be. So that's annoying, and I'm a dum-dum, but we still have Krenko! He displays a perverse charisma fueled by avarice. Highly dangerous. Recommend civil sanctions. Krenko's just the best. He's actually from the set before, the 2013 core set, which had a few Ravnican cards in it. And yes, despite the name, Magic 2013 did indeed come out before October 2012's Return to Ravnica. Wizards used that stupid naming convention for their core sets, where it had next year's name on it because, ooh, shiny. And they did this whilst simultaneously releasing a yearly title Commander product that was named for the year that it came out. Neither of those things are true anymore, and yet somehow magic is more confusing now to keep track of than ever. I will return to the topic now. Krenko's a guildless goblin mob boss who works out of a disused factory full of guildless goblins. He's kind of Fagin-esque, running a mini crime empire that draws in new goblins, as it does pilfered goods and shady jobs. You might know him from Commander, where he can churn out goblins faster than anyone else, and I don't know anything about other formats, but this Guildless Renegade is currently the most popular mono-red commander, so he's made quite the name for himself. On top of being Goblin Mob King, Krenko is also an infiltration expert, and Demir leader Lazav even hires Krenko to break into the Boros' base. After casing the joint, he enacts his own brand of goblin infiltration. Chaos is the best cover, and Krenko went about setting fires and kicking down doors. Floor 1, an incendiary rumour in a willing ear. Floor 2, punched yesterday's pompous goblin on his fat nose. Floor 3, spark bombs. Floor 4, actual bombs. By the time you reached the top tier, the halls were filled with the sound of thudding boots and alarmed shouts. Outside, swords clashed on the balcony, and no one noticed a snaggle-toothed goblin. And also, just because I love this, but Krenko is way better at detecting Lazav's shapeshifter nature than anyone else. In the novels, Lazav's disguises fool everyone, to the point of worm-tonguing various guild leaders and convincing the Selesnyan elf Amara that he's her romantic partner of years. But one meeting with Krenko and the goblins internally shuddering about how unnatural Lazav's skin looks. Krenko analysed how the skin wobbled beneath Taz's eyeballs and bunched up around his knuckles. Oh, it was obviously a skin suit, and not a very tailored one at that. They're less cool than him, but a few sets after RTR, we also got the Shattergang brothers, who end up in a gang war with Krenko because he killed their third brother. They're more demolition-focused than infiltration. And they don't get quite as much spotlight though, but Krenko's definitely the more memorable card and goblin. That's kind of it for named guildless characters this time around, and neither of their cards were actually in Return to Ravnica block. And they're all goblin mobsters. God damn you, Thibblethib. There are plenty of guildless actually in the block, I swear. They're just not legendary, so they're lacking names of their own. The Guildless Volunteer Police Force, the Hasda, are back, even if they didn't show up in Agents. And they're not a bunch of drunks, alright? Regardless of what the original novels say. Thankfully, the Hasda have retained the heroic tone they received in the first block's cards. They've been probation officers, army grunts, bounty hunters, anything to make their district safer. They only get the one named card this time around, but I think we might have a few more Hasda here than it might first appear. Palisade Giant certainly fits the bill. Refusing guild allegiances, she fights for those who can't protect themselves. There's a section in the style guide on guildless armor that emphasizes its relative simplicity and negative space where guild signets should be, and the distinction makes me think that the Hasda might show up on more cards than their name appears on. Every death has a web of consequences. Our job is to find the spider. Court Street Denizen has a noble goal while she stands nobly in her pristine armor. The Boros fight for justice. The Azorius fight for the law. I hold the line between and make sure the people are given both. I don't really know what this means, whether the Denizen is an overambitious Hasda or there's some kind of organization that invigilates between the Azorius and the Boros. I'm not sure if I believe that. Whether she's Hasda or not, I doubt that she can do much beyond stand there and shout, "You better be doing law properly," before she's fined for disturbing the peace. There's also this run of gatekeepers that have synergy with the block's new guild gate cards that represent gates into the different guilds' territories. None of the gatekeepers have a watermark, although these guys look very Azorius, and these could be Selesnyan. The other three are all sporting recognizably guildless armor, and they all have more of a sentry vibe than the volunteer Hasda police do. And their inclusion, alongside a lot more guildless armor in the set, gives some of the guildless an air of authority that they just didn't have in the original block. Maybe this implies that some small guildless factions have held on to some small amount of power since the guilds fell. More likely is the idea of the guilds outsourcing work as they rebuild. That's basically what Aurelia does with Gideon, and she lends him his own Boros regiment for a bit. But there are a few lines that point to a greater level of guildless organization than we're used to. The Haulers Collective wields great influence over the Ravnican merchant class. Without it, little moves in the city. Nice. Taking some power away from the guilds by monopolizing cargo services. Although if it's an industry in Ravnica that somehow isn't being cornered by the guilds, it's probably other guildless delivery services that are the ones really getting screwed by the Haulers Collective. Fighting fire with fire works just about as well for capitalism. Hey, why is everything on fire now? Whether or not the guildless scrape back a modicum of power from the guilds, it likely isn't much and definitely isn't enough. The Guildless are still positioned directly under heel, and whilst the population may have collectively agreed to trust the guilds again, this feeling is definitely not unanimous. The anti-guild sentiment from the original block that characterized so many of the Guildless cards back then is still here, and similarly, more organized than ever. The Gateless. The Gateless are the resentment of the ungilded personified. Or they should be. The Gateless have risen. The 10 shall fall. An organized movement of anti-guild radicals who take their name from their declaration to never enter a guild gate into gilded territory. Which honestly might just be an impractical dedication given how much the city's carved up by the guilds. The Gateless are mentioned a few times across the block's cards, and from these few mentions, we get the sense that they're clashing with the Boros particularly. Firemane Nirvana led the victorious assault on the Barbu rooftop rebels. Now, the Gateless have marked her for death. I hear that the Boros is losing its angels to the Gateless movement. I'm sure this comes as no surprise to you. The timeline article also mentions how, since their resurgence, the guilds have experienced random acts of violence as protest from the Gateless movement. And that is about it as far as all context for the Gateless goes. They don't show up in the novels at all, and across the 35 give or take short stories connected to the block, they never feature prominently, and they're only even mentioned about 2 or 3 times. I'd never been able to find associated stories for them before, and I'd hoped, in all the obsessive reading for this video, I'd stumble across that missing Guildless tale, but it just isn't there. And it really is a shame. The Gateless were one of the most mishandled elements of Return to Ravnica, in my opinion. They seem like this really cool, really natural consequence of the setting that could truly have been a really impactful element of it had they been properly fleshed out. But they just weren't. The lack of story really doesn't help, and whilst I mostly like what we got on the cards, it's just not enough to paint a compelling picture when that's almost all there is. When you put all of yourself into an attack, without fear or hesitation, in that instant, you may attain greatness. Predac, Gateless Free Mage. Great! We have one quote from a Gateless member for this entire block, and it's about how they get a buzz off of combat sometimes. Oh wow, who f***ing cares? This tells me nothing about them. If this was the one quote about the Gateless that you read, what picture would it paint for you? What an absolute waste of an opportunity. Wizards even occasionally interchangeably use the word Guildless and Gateless just to confuse this group's identity even further, and they call them the so-called Gateless, and they have Gideon call them that too. Ravnica's streets teemed with innocents caught in the crossfire of guild warfare. The so-called Gateless. Although he does sound like he's using the word to just mean guildless, because otherwise, it really just looks like Gideon, champion of justice, deriding the uprising of the oppressed. To Wizards' credit, they do have Gideon think more heroically about them later on, while he's caught up in that goblin gang war. As long as it was just goblins killing goblins, most guilds were content to observe the conflict from behind the safety of their guild gates. As long as the fighting continued, the ungilded population, the Gateless, was in danger. Unacceptable. So thanks, Gideon, that was nice, except for when you interchangeably used the 2 words again! It does irk me a bit how Wizards use this condemnatory tone to describe the Gateless, but this is mitigated a little bit by the angelic endorsement they receive from the defecting Boros angels. I think I mentioned this last time, but Ravnica's angels are pure mana beings with an inborn sense of justice, and so the Gateless are lent some legitimacy through their endorsement. But it really feels like Wizards could have taken them a bit more seriously. Given how well drawn the oppression the Guildless faces, you'd think that the people driven to rebellion against the guilds would be presented with a bit more humanity and understanding than they are. Ravnica does a great job presenting this exploitative system and all these believable conditions for its oppressed underclass to the point where it's completely understandable that a group of organized radicals would oppose the ruling guilds. And then the radicals show up, barely, and we have a chance to learn what they want, or what they believe, or how they plan on achieving those things, or who, if anyone, leads them, or how they organize, or how they affect the larger setting, or what their existence says about Ravnica, or just who any of them are, and in place of any interesting perspective, or any kind of message or point, we get to hear about how when one of them does fighting, he thinks that's cool. Still, a scant few references presented with a little bit of derision are the entirety of what the Gateless amount to at the end. What a shame. The Gateless actually remind me of the Guildless overall in the first block. How in Ravnica 1, it felt like the Guildless were only there because Wizards realized they should be, but didn't give them much consideration beyond that. And now in return, the Guildless overall have gotten proper consideration, and the Gateless are the thrown-in afterthought. I know I'm looking back at the block, specifically examining the Ungilded, and when they were making it, Wizards didn't choose to focus on a sub-faction within the largest but most irrelevant faction. There was a lot of other stuff to dedicate their time to. But, you know, it's annoying. The Guildless aren't the block's focus, and the Gateless certainly aren't. Ravnica 2 wanted to do what 1 did good. It was going to bring back the guilds and return them to their full dual-colour strength. And of course, there's only really one way to do that. Let's talk about the actual story. Like, the book. The main book plot. The Bleeding Maze. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail than I did last time, as I feel it's a little bit more relevant than the first block story, other than the guild pack blowing up. To understand the state Ravnica's in at the end of Return block, we're gonna have to know what happens in these books. Much to the suspicion of the other guilds, all across Ravnica City, the Izzet and the Dimir are searching for clues. I'm in the field of procurement, and business is good. The guilds want all kinds of maps and relics these days, though what they want them for, I'm not quite sure. What they're searching for is a secret that runs along powerful ley lines of mana throughout each of the 10 guilds' territories in the 10th district. A maze, but a magical route rather than a structure. In the first 2 sets, the guilds obsessively search for information on the maze. They don't know much about it, other than that it holds the potential for power that any guild would crave. But much will be illuminated by a third party, who's accidentally stumbled on it himself. Jace Valerian is back on Ravnica, and he's the protagonist of this block's book series, The Secretist. Which is referring to Lazav, apparently. I don't know why. When we find him, he's investigating strange patterns he's found in architecture, and before he's even realized what he's researching, he's made himself the target of the 2 investigating guilds. What ensues is a rollicking romp round Ravnica, with Jace butting heads with all the 10 guilds as the various different parties all try to uncover what the maze actually is. He fights the Rakdos on stage, gets arrested by the Azorius, snatched by the Dimir, and even hires the Gruul to do some demolition for him, before using his mind magic to creatively beat them in a pit fight. By the end of it, and despite Jace wiping his own memory at one point, most of the major searching parties find out what the maze is and how it works. The implicit maze was crafted by the absent Azorius founder, Azor, who authored the original pact. The maze has the potential to offer one that completes it the power of the Guild Pact. Essentially, reigniting the magical bonds of the old pact and restoring its power, but this time centering that power around a single being, the living Guild Pact. As well as being the magical restraining balance between the guilds, potentially, in the wrong hands, this power could offer the living Guild Pact supreme authority over Ravnica, which doesn't seem very Guild Pacty. But Azor did foresee this eventuality and made some efforts to try and prevent it. Mostly thanks to Jace having a chat with an invisible, intangible ghost man who's stuck at the finish line and happy to dish out information on the maze, because he's like Azor's official maze judge. Everyone learns how it works. That each of the 10 guilds must all run the maze simultaneously, and all complete it, for them to succeed. So all the guilds organize maze runners and line up to race for Ravnican supremacy. And Jace is there too, because he has a crush on the Slesnian runner. So the runners and their teams turn the city into a giant game of Mario Kart sans the cart, as they all loop through the 10 guild gates that mark the maze. They generally forget that they're all supposed to finish it though, and their efforts to stop each other get pretty lethal. Despite this, they all eventually make it to the finish line at Azor's Forum, and nothing happens. No one's declared the winner, and as they're all standing there, waiting for something to happen, the tension begins to rise, and the maze runners start to turn on each other. Fighting breaks out as the maze runners play out old guild feuds on a micro scale, ignoring Jace's meek protests. Desperate, Jace reaches out to the invisible maze ghost man, and the bailiff, as they're called, is none too impressed with what they've seen. You see, the real maze, this whole time, was friendship. The reason all the guilds had to run it together and pass through each of each other's gates was because they were supposed to get along. Not race and stab each other and bar the way, you dummies. And now that they're all just fighting at the finish line? Disgraceful. The bailiff tells Jace that if the guilds can't get along, then they all fail and they all get the anti-prize. They'll all get given their own copy of Supreme Verdict, a popular kill-everything spell from the block, which, according to the bailiff, is basically going to allow the guilds to selectively wipe each other out. And they probably all do it too. They're pretty angry right now. Anyway, it doesn't matter how the board's getting wiped, because it is going to get wiped if the guilds all get failing grades in friendship. All the maze runners are clashing, everyone's going to die, and the Dimir are egging on the guild apocalypse. Lazav presumably believing he can survive it somehow. In a last-ditch effort to save everyone, Jace uses a mind mage technique that he barely knows and gives him really bad headaches. Which is a fair complaint. Headaches suck. So now, as all hope is lost, Jace desperately uses that technique again and heroically gives himself a migraine to empathically connect each of the 10 maze runners to each other and quell the violence. Jace turns himself into an emotional bridge, allowing each of them to feel how each other are feeling, and finally, the 10 guilds see things from each other's perspective. Varolz could sense the hot-headed frustration of Ixava, who could directly perceive the militant zeal of Tajik, who could share the belligerent rebellion of Rurik Tar, who could see the passion for order and law in the heart of Lavinia. They all get a passing grade in friendship, but Jace is top of the class. For his ability to make the guilds get along long enough to not die, Jace is awarded the grand prize. Look, he's got his own special card for it and everything. Jace, the living guild pact. So that's that. The pact is back. The pact is man now. This Jace man here. Whether he wants it or not, Jace is a guild pact. Things are changing again for Ravnica. The power of the old pact has returned, but it's never been a guy before. What happens when your guild pact is a guy now? There's too many questions. Is Jace in charge now? How does he feel about it? What if he dies? Or more likely, just leaves? He's probably gonna leave. He's just the type for it. The card type. Would the pact be okay? And what about the city plane and her downtrodden guildless? How's this gonna shake down for them? Honestly, is Jace good for the place? Is Jace good for the place? Almost as soon as Jace has declared the living pact, Niv Mizzet tests its boundaries. The Izzet wish to declare war on Selesnya, he said, his great yellow eye twitching. The dragon was gauging Jace's reaction. You may not, said Jace quietly. The spines on the dragon's cheeks flexed slightly. He leaned in with his great neck, bringing his monstrous head right down by Jace's face, dwarfing his entire body. Very well, said the dragon. Jace is definitely the final word on Ravnica then, and as well as mediating between the guilds, the Living Guild Pact seems to have the ability to enact new magical laws and has the magical deciding word on guild disputes. Jace is now at the heart of Ravnican politics, and he's set up in a big old building at the heart of the 10th. The Chamber of the Guild Pact serves as Jace's office, and a place for people to come and seek an audience with the Living Guild Pact. He's even got the Azorius maze runner Lavinia to be an advisory counselor to him, but this essentially boils down to her being his secretary / doing his job for him when he's off plane. Almost as soon as he's made Guild Pact, Jace decides he needs an advisory council of representatives from every guild, but up to the point where we're catching up with Jace at least, we've never seen them. Thankfully, Jace is taking the bailiff's grading to heart and decides to be Ravnica's mediator rather than its ruler. I'm not an emperor. I don't lead the guilds. I just have the privilege of trying to keep them from devouring each other. So, the potential dictator problem caused by Azor's failsafe is at least solved for now by Jace being nice. Jace has come quite some way across a few different writers since we saw him in Agents of Artifice. That book showed us a Jace who's as morally as we'll see him. Blackmailing, mind-wiping people, assisting assassins, and feeling guilt over how little guilt it all brings him. Most of this he signs on for, seemingly for the money and the opportunity to increase his mind powers, which he does to be fair. But it's all pretty morally bankrupt. He even stole his friend's mind for months on end before letting him die still thinking he was Jace. It's messed. But by the end, after having his morality stretched and tested, Jace at least realizes he doesn't have much of a fortitude for hurting people before severing his connection to the organization that was getting him to do all that stuff. By the time we see him again in RTR, a couple of stories later, one of which I'm not sure is canon anymore, Jace is a much more likable, much more protagonist-y guy. He feels bad about the bad things he did before and he doesn't want to do them again. Across Return Block's 3 short books, Jace will go from mostly only being concerned with himself and his friend Amara to saddling the responsibilities thrust upon him and giving up his connection to Amara to focus on Ravnica at large. And Jace does think of Ravnica as his home. A lot of my memories from my childhood are gone, chopped up in my head into a few impressions. Most of what I remember begins here, on Ravnica. I'll never have roots here the way you do, and I admit I'm off to other planes a lot, but I think of myself as Ravnican to the core, too. So we can see that despite his shady history, Jace has the potential to help Ravnica, rather than any particular moment or trigger for character growth. This is of course mostly because Wizards was positioning Jace as a much more typical protagonist-y type in RTR than he was in Agents. And so now his worst character traits amount to trying to feel less jealous of his crush Amara's partner, rather than trying to feel less guilty about murder. So, as the hero of the story, I can definitely vouch for his intentions. Wait, that implied that I was the hero of the story. I meant Jace. And now that he's the Guild Pact, he is in an exploitable position. And we can see that as Jace is bogged down with the endless minutiae of lore and the equally endless stream of people, both conflicting with his off-plane responsibilities, he has fallen prey to those less naive than he. Miss Karloff, I'm extremely busy and need to go, Jace asserted, shoving a grappling hook and traveller's coat into his bag, frantic sweat on his brow. Would you also agree that stealing is illegal? Yes, please leave. After asking him to confirm no less than 20 minor laws and legal requirements, it was worth getting kicked to the curb by the Living Guild Pact himself. Any law verbally affirmed by the Living Guild Pact is unbreakable to the person he speaks the affirmation to. All I need to do is directly reference a law affirmed by him, and it must be made manifest. I had him affirm roughly 20 minor laws. He was ever so annoyed. Teysa smiled. It was precious. I feel like Jace could probably do with utilizing a few more legal advisors than just the one Azorius arrester. Why even have Lavinia around if she's not going to stop this exact thing from happening? The pact is only as impenetrable as Jace is too, and if he dies, it dies with him. Which is mostly fine for a guy who can teleport to a different world to avoid threats, but is a problem when those threats can do the same. Like the Golgari Gorgon assassin planeswalker, Vraska, whom Jace ultimately foils, but not before she's turned a bunch of people into YMCA-style statues to spell out messages to the Living Guild Pact. Vraska's methods are pretty murdery, but her concerns are ones likely shared by many Ravnicans. I arranged this visit because I want you to prove to us what's inside you. Show us whether you'll be our ally. An ally of Ravnica. Murdering Ravnicans is a strange way to be Ravnica's ally, Jace said to the cobblestones. So is stealing control of the Guild Pact, Vraska snapped. This is not your plane, and yet you take such a strong interest in it. Jace is ultimately an unknown to the plane. Even his friend Amara thought his name was Berim for years. He's a reclusive man. And Vraska, a victim of institutionalized violence herself, seems to think that Jace will do little more than allow the guild's oppression to continue. Which, yeah. Vraska wants them torn down, and her plan to do so, which she foolishly monologues, gives us a bit of a window into the source of the guild's power. With your help, I will neuter all the guild mages, disempower them by having you redraw territory borders, rupturing their mana bonds, defang the guilds by taking their spellcasters. Then, one by one, I will assassinate the guild leaders. That's a much more complete plan than we ever see out of the bloody Gateless, at least. She's obviously unsuccessful at both killing the guilds, and really even with confronting Jace with the oppression of the system that he's inheriting that so clearly motivates her. She doesn't really attempt to appeal to his humanity. Jace is taking his responsibilities seriously, but he likely isn't aware of the extent of the guild's exploitation, or doesn't express an awareness, at least. With many at his throat and all of Ravnica on his back, Jace ultimately seems really worn down by the job. He groaned. It wasn't that the work was hard, quite the opposite. It was a lot of work, and hardly any challenge. So, what's it like? Asked Liliana. Being the Guild Pact. Exhausting, said Jace. Everyone wants a piece of you. You're pulled in 10 different directions, all the time. Okay, don't get too burnt out, Jace, or you're going to start sounding Azorius. You will file a proper complaint with Deputy Lavinia, he said, to a chorus of scoffing. Return to Sunhome, and the deputy will handle it in due course according to chamber procedure. He's also got some off-planar responsibilities that will drag him away from Ravnica too, because he's the magic protagonist man. Look, he's in all these non-Ravnica sets. And he justifies leaving through his lack of faith in himself. He gathered his cloak around him. The Guild Pact is supposed to keep people safe, he murmured. But I've only brought them more danger. Luckily the Pact is still intact while he's off-plane, and whilst he is gallivanting on Zendikar or wherever, at least no one stuck on Ravnica can kill the Pact and plunge the world into chaos again. So as the status quo shifts again for the final time this video, we've got to ask once more, how does this affect the Ungilded? Is the Jace era good for the Guildless? As depressing as it sounds for the city's underprivileged, I'd say that so far, this has the potential to be the best era of Ravnica for the old Ungilded. Not by a lot, to be clear. It's generally comparable to the original block, with a couple of slightly nicer guild leaders. But Ravnica is better for the commoners with someone there to mediate between the guilds, which Jace is apparently good at. Especially someone who can take some power away from the absolutism of their rule. Even if it's just to dampen their worst impulses and hold them to their Guild Pact responsibilities, better that the Living Guild Pact be there than not. Jace could potentially implement reforms that could require the guilds to help the populace, and change things for his, technically, fellow guildless. But the Ungilded aren't mentioned amongst Jace's concerns. When deciding he needs that advisory council, Jace says he wants representatives from every guild, but makes no mention of anyone to represent the largest population group. It doesn't seem like he's here to shake things up, and his position seems to be that he doesn't understand enough to want to change things about Ravnica. Which isn't a bad perspective for someone with Jace's amount of leadership experience and knowledge of the role, but by failing to question the status quo of the guilds, Jace is allowing a whole lot of systemized suffering to continue. systemized is the right word. I said systemified last time, I don't think that's even a word. Oh well. Well, at least now there's someone kind of in charge who might be empathetic to the ungilded plight. If they can just manage to beat the queues at the Forum of the Guild Pact and show up on a day when he's actually in. Gideon had personally petitioned the Chamber of the Guild Pact to intervene, which essentially boiled down to adding his name and guild to the bottom of a very long wait list. But even if he's drowning under the weight of all the responsibility, at least compared to the other powers that be, Jace does actually seem to care about people. I mean, he has to, or he won't be likable enough to sell cards. And he may not want the job, but at least he's willing to do it, and many in his place would do a lot more harm with the power he wields. If I had to pick a winner for the prize of biggest off-world hero to the Guildless this time around, I'd probably pick Gideon, to be honest. For helping the citizens of the 9th District, and also being the only one willing to intervene in the Guildless Goblin gang war. But Jace did stop everyone from dying, so there is that, and he's giving the Guild Pact thing his best shot. Ravnica under Jace is about as good a situation as the Guildless can expect. If we can just get him to stay focused on his Guild Pact responsibility... Oh, he's gone again. Concl-ending. So here we are, at the end of RTR. The Guildless have been through a whole lot since the end of Ravnica 1. Across the constant political shifts and strife, the ungilded always pay the cost, but they've kept their heads above water. The guilds have returned and retained their power, but also admitted that they need the Guildless to function. But we've also seen how, without the guilds, the Guildless are probably even worse off. Finally, the status quo shifts to its best position so far for the ungilded. Probably. With someone in charge who is technically guildless himself and might have their best interests at heart. But the best out of many possible bad situations is all they can ever really hope for. And that's actually great. For us, not for them. As much as it's fun and illuminating to talk about the harm the guilds cause from a perspective that's empathetic to the guildless, we kind of need the ungilded to keep getting oppressed and turn into mulch. Not doing so would serve to shave down the edges of the guild's cruelty, and that's the last thing we should want. As was true in the first block, the Guildless's primary job is still as tools to the larger setting, and alongside filling out backgrounds and making us empathise with shopkeepers, they've always been used to demonstrate the failure and cruelty of the Plains rulers. I'm not sure my tone throughout this series has been clear, but I'm not trying to cancel the guilds. It's because they're so f***ed up that they're so great. Because their corruption and inadequacy is just so familiar, and reminds us of the failures and short-sightedness of the real-world institutions we're all stuck with. Ravnica has always presented its guilds with a degree of hypocrisy that contrasts with their supposedly altruistic goals, and never asked its players to take its status quo at face value. Now, I really don't believe these circumstance-questioning themes are there to get you to question our real-world neoliberal status quo or whatever. And if providing real-world critique of institutionalized issues was amongst the goals of Return to Ravnica, I imagine it was low down the list. Ravnica isn't trying to inform you on reality. It's informed by reality to improve its setting, and to make you more invested in it. In more ways than one. And I really feel Wizards' failure to present the Gateless as a compelling presence sticks out as a potential avenue to provide a deeper critique that just wasn't taken. The Gateless could have given a proper voice to the well-earned resentment of the city's oppressed people, but they did not. But as much as the Gateless annoy me, their soggy presentation does very little to damage RTR overall. In Return to Ravnica, the character of Ravnica and its people, informed as it is by the failure of institutions, is stronger even than in the first block, and it's in no small part due to the work put into fleshing out the Guildless and properly integrating them into the world this time. The powerless peons really tie the room together now, and comparing their designs to the Guildless of Ravnica 1 really demonstrates how successful the work put into the style guide was, and how much legitimacy the Guildless had lent through their consistency. While the depth of the visual language the concept team created for them still allows for expressive individuality that makes the Guildless feel real themselves. Instead of all the horrors of guild oppression happening to a bunch of contradictorily costumed weirdos in abstract spaces, they're happening to the city's relatable, believable, recognizable underclass. Where last time the Guildless felt like little more than a necessary consequence of the setting, thrown in as an afterthought, in RTR, the Guildless finally feel integral. They've got their very own face on which to feel the falling rain, and they've been given the treatment from Wizards they needed to be better at their unfortunate job than ever before. With the Guildless receiving the attention they so desperately deserved, the picture of Ravnica now feels complete. In Return to Ravnica, the Guildless are finally defined, and in turn, they refine Ravnica. Oh, well that's nice. Or at least not quite so disheartening as before. The Guildless are still getting turned into mulch, but at least now they look consistent enough for us to benefit from the believability of the whole thing. Yeah, something like that. Throughout all the horrors of the changing political climate, the Guildless have limped this far, but the finish line is still a ways off. We've got one last Ravnica block to go. 2018's incredibly creatively named Guilds of Ravnica. Things are shifting once again for the city plane, and with the Pact returned, the tension between guilds has no way to dissipate and grows ever higher. Things look set to boil over once again as, left and right, guild leaders are replaced with fiery new upstarts and paranoia reigns supreme. With everyone pointing their daggers at each other, no one has any attention left to pay to external forces moving indistinctly, just outside their peripheries. Join me next time when the tale of Ravnica and the Guildless comes to a close. With our beloved city being pulled in at least a dozen different directions by forces more powerful than she can imagine, we've got to ask what we always do. What about the people at the bottom? It'd be weird if you watched 2 out of 3 parts of something, right? The incompleteness of that would make me feel ill. I don't want you to feel ill, so come back and watch part 3, please and thank you. You can turn the video off now, unless you want to hear me say, thanks for watching, and you could like it and subscribe, because that is also good. If you share the video, then you'll get like 1,000 more points. Thank you for watching. I'll see you then. So as the status quo shifts for the final time, oh yeah, I'm totally gonna install that. Ooh. Oh yeah. I'm tempted to go do that now. Oh no, I can't do it. I can do it now. I can do it right now. I can do it from here. I can install Superhot, Mind Control Delete, that's what it's called, right now. I'm glad I remembered that game existed. I'm way in the mood for that. Oh, my ears, itchy.